I am Sloane Mercer, 33 years old. And tonight, the empire I built in silence is about to collide with the world that once dismissed me. My fingers tighten around the leather of my clutch as my father's voice cuts through my memory, the same words that branded me at 18, Sloane will never be the bright one. Now I'm parked in my black Mercedes S-Class, outside the Grand Boston Club, where his honorary gala is underway, the kind of place I was never meant to belong. Inside this clutch is a billion-dollar truth I've kept hidden from everyone, especially from my brother, his golden child. Tonight, in front of Boston's elite, that truth will explode. Growing up in Beacon Hill meant cobblestone streets, houses older than the country itself, and neighbours who measured worth in diplomas and family names. Our home was filled with the scent of leather-bound books and my father's lectures. Richard Mercer, Harvard professor, intellectual icon, and master of the cold compliment, ran it like an extension of his classroom. My mother Maggie, once a gifted painter, traded her gallery shows for teaching community art classes. And then there was Jack, my older brother, the walking proof of everything my father valued, with walls lined in trophies to prove it. My space in that world was smaller, quieter, but tonight all of that is about to change. The air inside the car was warm from the drive up from Manhattan, almost too still, as if it knew this was a moment to hold its breath. Through the tinted glass, I could see my father just beyond the entrance, bathed in the soft gold light spilling from crystal chandeliers. He was surrounded by men in tailored suits and women in silk gowns, his handshake firm, his laugh deep and confident. He looked exactly as he had my whole life, composed, untouchable, certain of his place in the world. My hand drifted back to the clutch in my lap, feeling the ridge of the envelope inside. Just a few crisp sheets of paper, but they carried the weight of everything I'd worked for, every quiet victory he never saw. 15 years ago, I sat at our long dining table in the Beacon Hill townhouse. My acceptance letter to the State University lay unopened in front of me. My father leaned back in his chair, swirling Cabernet in his glass, and said, "Sloane will never be the bright one." He didn't need to raise his voice. The verdict was already sealed in his mind. Jack smirked. My mother kept her gaze fixed on her plate, her fork moving in small, distracted motions. I cut my chicken into neat bites and swallowed each one like a stone. That sentence didn't just bruise me, it settled in my bones, a silent marker that I carried everywhere. Now, here I was, 33, standing just outside his circle, the October air sharp against my skin. The midnight blue silk of my dress shifted with each step as I walked toward the entrance heels, striking the stone in measured, deliberate clicks. A camera flashed somewhere nearby, catching someone else's arrival. Not for me. Not yet. But the night was young. I was ready for him to see me. I was ready for everyone to see me. I was ready for him to see me. I was ready for everyone to see me. I stepped into the grand lobby, the marble floor gleaming under the soft light of the chandeliers. My father stood near the centre of the room, surrounded by people leaning in, as if every word he spoke was a revelation. Richard Mercer wasn't just my father, he was a Harvard professor, with a reputation so polished it could blind you if you looked too closely. He carried himself like a man who had never once doubted his own judgment, someone who believed the world divided neatly into the capable and the forgettable. I'd grown up knowing which side he thought I belonged to. My mother Maggie was standing a few feet away from him, wearing a soft grey dress that blended into the crowd. She was smiling polite, her hands clasped together in front of her. Years ago, she'd been a painter, her work vibrant and bold, with a small gallery following. But after she married my father, the canvases were stored away, and she traded art shows for quiet afternoons teaching children at the community centre. She had a way of making people feel safe, of softening the edges in any room except this one. Here she kept herself small, careful not to overshadow my father's spotlight. Jack was across the room laughing, with two men in dark suits, a glass of bourbon in his hand. 3 years older than me, Jack was the golden child, the kind of son my father could proudly present to the world. Harvard law partner at a prestigious firm before 35, and the owner of a trophy case that took up an entire wall in my father's study. In our home, Jack's achievements were framed, polished, and displayed like family heirlooms. Mine were smaller sometimes, unframed, often tucked into a corner or left in a drawer. The house itself told the story better than anyone could. The study was Jack's territory, his diplomas, his awards, his photographs, shaking hands with people whose names carried weight. The kitchen was my mother's space, warm but out of sight. My room tucked away on the 3rd floor might as well have been a guest room. I learned early to take up less space, to move quietly, to never expect my father to look at me the way he looked at Jack. Standing there now, watching the three of them in the same room again, I felt the same currents I'd grown up with my father at the centre, Jack at his right hand, my mother in the background, and me on the outside observing. But tonight, I wasn't here to stay on the edges. Tonight, I'd stepped into this circle for a reason. But tonight, I wasn't here to stay on the edges. Tonight, I'd stepped into this circle for a reason. A circle I had been kept out of for most of my life. At 18, I loved behavioural economics, the way human choices bent and broke the rules of logic. But I struggled with the advanced math that seemed to be the golden ticket into Harvard. Jack breezed through it, of course, and my father loved to point that out. When the acceptance letters came, Jack's to Harvard Law years earlier was still framed in the living room, but mine was from a state university's business program. My father looked at it like it was a parking ticket. He called it a waste of potential and money, and then announced he wouldn't be paying for it. So, I worked. I poured coffee in the mornings at a cafe 2 blocks from campus. I tutored high school students in the afternoons. And at night, I filed papers at the university library. I learned to live on little sleep and to make ramen noodles feel like a meal. I told myself I didn't need his money, but some nights that lie was harder to believe. Halfway through my first semester, a plain white envelope showed up in my campus mailbox. Inside was a crisp $500 billfold and a note in my mother's handwriting for books and coffee. No signature, no explanation, but I knew it was from her. I read it over and over, the words soft but heavy with meaning. She couldn't stand up to my father directly, but she could send these small lifelines. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel seen. That quiet act stayed with me for years. It was proof that someone in that house still believed in me, even if they could only say it in whispers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel seen. That quiet act stayed with me for years. It was proof that someone in that house still believed in me, even if they could only say it in whispers. I carried that belief to New York the summer after graduation, clutching a thin savings account and a job offer from a mid-tier investment firm whose name sounded grander than its reputation. The office sat on the 24th floor of a glass tower in Midtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the whole city feel like it was on display. My first day, I wore a tailored navy suit from a clearance rack and shoes that pinched slightly at the toes. Around me, people glided past in designer heels and custom suits, carrying leather portfolios, and the easy confidence of those who'd been told all their lives that they belonged here. Most of them had Ivy League degrees framed on their office walls. I had a state university diploma still in a cardboard tube in my apartment. The difference was palpable, like walking into a conversation halfway through and realizing no one plans to explain the jokes. Colin Whitford was the first to size me up. He was tall, crisp, blonde hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He'd gone to Princeton, then Harvard Business School, and wore his credentials like a badge. On my third day, he glanced at my coffee mug, the one with my university's logo, and said, "Cute." A little underdog energy for the office. He made it sound like a compliment. It wasn't. I learned quickly that in this world, pedigree was currency, and I was short on change. I worked late, often the last to leave, double-checking numbers and combing through research reports, while others headed to rooftop bars. No one noticed, or at least no one said they did, until I met Vicky Grant. She was a partner at another firm, older than most in the room at the industry conference where we crossed paths. We'd both been standing by the coffee urn, avoiding the overly loud panel discussion about emerging markets. She asked what I did, and when I told her, she tilted her head and said, "Not Ivy Wright." I braced for the judgment, but she just smiled. Good. Means you know what it's like to have to prove yourself. Then she handed me her card. Later over lunch, she leaned in and said, "Here's the truth, you'll work twice as hard for half the credit." Still in, I didn't hesitate. I'm in. That lunch was the closest thing I'd had to mentorship, and I held on to her words like armour. Back at my firm, the divide between me and the others grew more defined. Colin seemed to make it his mission to remind me of my place. It's all about the network, he'd say in the elevator, as if I didn't already know. He'd talk about ski trips with alumni private dinners, with partners, the kind of connections I couldn't fake. I let it roll off me, or at least pretended to. What I didn't know was that he wasn't just being smug, he was watching me, looking for an opening. My work became my shield. I volunteered for the messiest accounts, took on projects no one else wanted, and learned to navigate Bloomberg terminals faster than most associates. I thought merit would be enough. I thought if I proved myself, they'd have no choice but to respect me. I was wrong. What I didn't see then was the way Colin's eyes lingered when I presented ideas in meetings, not with interest, but calculation. Like he was already thinking about how to make them his. That's the thing about this world. Ambition isn't the same as hunger. Hunger makes you grind. Ambition, when paired with entitlement, makes people dangerous. I had one of those people sitting two desks away. So, when the partners announced they wanted a deep dive analysis on an under-the-radar tech startup in clean energy, I knew this was my shot. The project was high-stakes potential for a massive return if the market moved the way early indicators suggested, and they needed the work turned around in 3 weeks. This was the kind of assignment that could put my name in front of the right people, the kind of win that could finally erase the state school label that followed me like a shadow. I threw myself into it. Mornings blurred into nights as I sifted through financial statements, market trends, patent filings, and consumer adoption data. I built a model that didn't just predict growth. It told a story about why this company was positioned to dominate. Every number had a source. Every chart had a narrative. By the second week, I was running on caffeine and stubborn pride, but I didn't care. This was mine. Colin noticed. He'd stop by my desk with fake curiosity. "How's your little project going?" or make comments about how quiet I'd been lately. I brushed him off, too busy to take the bait. On the Friday before the presentation, I stayed late polishing the final draft. I left my laptop locked in my desk drawer, the printed report in a folder under my chair. Monday morning, I came in early to review it one last time. The folder was gone. I checked my email, the shared drive, nothing. My files had been wiped clean. I told myself maybe IT had a backup, but before I could call, I heard Colin's voice from the conference room. I walked by and froze. My charts, my exact formatting, my projections only, the numbers had been tweaked slightly, were up on the screen. Colin was presenting them to the partners like they were his. I stood there in the hallway, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After the meeting, I confronted him. He just smiled and said, "You should really keep better track of your work. In this business, ideas are only yours as long as you can protect them." Then he walked away. It claimed they couldn't retrieve anything. The backup system had been overwritten. HR chalked it up to miscommunication, told me to focus on the next project. The partners praised Colin for his initiative and attention to detail. My review that quarter said I was slow to deliver and lacked urgency. The promotion I'd been aiming for went to someone else. That night, I stayed late again, not working, just sitting at my desk, long after everyone left, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. I thought about the years I'd spent clawing my way here, about every cup of coffee I'd poured to pay tuition, about my mother's quiet 500 thalers in an envelope. And I thought about how quickly it could all be stolen. As I was packing up, I saw Colin through the glass wall of his office, leaning back in his chair with his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, casual. "Yeah, it's done," he said, then hung up. I didn't think much of it at the time, just assumed it was another smug client update. But later, much later, I'd find out that call wasn't to a client. It was to Jack. At the time, though, all I knew was that something in me had cracked wide open. That night, I walked out of the office, my laptop bag slung over my shoulder, and I didn't look back. I'd spent years playing by rules written for someone else's victory, convincing myself that hard work and clean hands would be enough. But in that glass tower with its tailored suits and polite daggers, I finally understood the game was rigged, and I was done being a pawn. My resignation email was short 2 sentences, no explanation. I didn't give them the satisfaction of an exit interview. By the next week, my ID badge was deactivated, my desk cleared out. No champagne send-off, no good luck cake, just a quiet erasure. But in the silence that followed, I started to hear something else possibility. I didn't want another job in another firm just like the one I'd left. I wanted my own, not just a paycheck. A place where the smartest ideas didn't get stolen in boardrooms, where deals were made because they were right, not because someone's roommate's cousin was on the golf course with a partner. I called it Aurora Capital Partners. Aurora for the first light of day, the promise of a new beginning. No Mercer anywhere in the name. The early days were brutal. I worked from a sublet office with a flickering overhead light and a view of a brick wall. My first hires were 2 analysts I'd met at conferences, sharp hungry, and just as uninterested in the Ivy League Old Boys Club as I was. We ran numbers until our eyes burned, cold-called founders and pitched investors in coffee shops. I lived on black coffee and takeout salads, my savings dwindling by the week. Then I called Tom Harrington. I'd met him years earlier at a finance panel where I'd asked a question everyone else was too polite to ask. He'd remembered me for it. Over lunch, I laid out my planned socially impactful investments in tech and sustainable industries, data-driven strategies, a lean team with skin in the game. Tom listened without interrupting, then said, "You've got guts. I like that." A week later, the funds hit my account. It wasn't massive, but it was enough to launch. Our first investments hit faster than I dared hope. A renewable energy startup doubled its valuation in a year. A mental health app got FDA approval for its AI-driven therapy tool. Word started to spread not about me, but about Aurora. I kept it that way on purpose. My name never appeared in press releases. I skipped panels and photo ops. I wanted the work to speak, not my face. But success, I learned, is fragile. 6 months in one of our flagship startups, a sustainable food company, imploded almost overnight after a supply chain scandal. Investors panicked. One major backer called me at 2 a.m. His voice cold, suggesting we rethink our portfolio and consider leadership changes if I wanted funding to continue. For the first time since leaving the firm, I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I barely slept, running endless numbers, trying to figure out how to keep Aurora alive without gutting what made it different. My team could see the strain. I remember sitting in the office at midnight, head in my hands, wondering if Colin had been right that the only way to survive in this business was to play dirty. But then I thought about why I'd started Aurora in the first place, about every slammed door and stolen idea, and I knew quitting now would make all of that meaningless. I called Tom. We talked for hours. He didn't sugarcoat the situation, but told me, weather this and you'll earn the kind of credibility money can't buy. We pivoted, hard-cut, non-essential costs, doubled down on 2 high-performing ventures, and brought in a crisis PR team to get ahead of the narrative. It was a grind, and there were days I felt hollow. But slowly the panic faded. Our numbers steadied. We closed a new round of funding. Then, one morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Texts, emails, LinkedIn messages. CNN had run a full segment on Aurora Capital Partners, calling it one of the most visionary boutique investment firms in America and praising its innovative leadership. They aired footage of our office interviews with portfolio founders, even a shot of our analysts at work. I wasn't in it by design. That afternoon, a mutual acquaintance called to tell me they'd watched the segment with my father. He said the CEO must be a brilliant man. The acquaintance laughed, said he'd love to meet him someday. I thanked them and hung up. Then I sat there, my coffee cooling in my hand, thinking about how easy it was for him to admire what I'd built when he thought it belonged to someone else. I didn't feel angry. Not exactly. More amused. He'd spent years telling me I wasn't the bright one, and now, without knowing it, he was applauding me. It was tempting to tell him right then, but I decided against it. Some truths deserve the right stage. The invitation came 2 days later, arriving in a heavy cream envelope with my father's name embossed in gold at the top. I almost tossed it in the recycling bin without opening it, but the weight of the paper made me pause. Inside was a formal card announcing that Richard Mercer would be honoured at the Boston Heritage Club, one of those old money institutions where membership was handed down like a family heirloom. The card described him as a pillar of intellectual excellence and mentor to a generation of leaders. There was a note at the bottom, black tie. No media. I stared at it for a full minute before letting out a short laugh. No media, of course. This was about control, about curating an image that fit neatly inside their idea of legacy. My first instinct was to decline. The idea of standing in a room full of people who had either ignored me or pitied me for most of my life made my stomach turn. I didn't need to be there. My life now was miles away from that world, and I liked it that way. I placed the invitation on my kitchen counter and tried to forget about it. But later that night, as I was scrolling through my phone, an email popped up with the subject line, Boston Heritage Club guest list. Someone from my old college network had forwarded it to me, probably by accident. I opened it, and the names rolled down the screen like a hall of ghosts. Former professors who had smiled thinly when my father introduced me as the creative one instead of the bright one. Family, friends who'd asked about Jack's internships at white shoe law firms, while ignoring the fact that I'd been working 3 jobs to pay tuition. And there it was, Colin Whitford, the man who had stolen my work and derailed my first big promotion. His name printed neatly between a venture capitalist and a state senator. I sat back in my chair, the glow from my phone screen washing over me. This wasn't just a tribute to my father. This was a gathering of the very people who had once decided who I was allowed to be. And for the first time in years, I wanted to be in that room, not as the overlooked daughter, not as the quiet one in the corner, but as the woman who had built something they couldn't have imagined. The decision settled in me like a slow burning fuse. I didn't tell anyone, not even my team. If I was going to do this, I wanted it to be my move alone. Over the next week, I prepared the way I would for a high-stakes pitch. I had a dress tailored in deep navy silk, sharp and understated, shoes that could carry me through hours of standing without a flicker of discomfort, jewellery that caught the light without screaming for attention. I practiced keeping my voice steady and my smile measured. I researched the club's floor plan so I'd know exactly where to stand, when to move, and how to let people find me instead of the other way around. There was a strange calm in the preparation, like lining up chess pieces before the first move. I wasn't going there to pick a fight. I was going there to take up space I'd once been denied. On the night before the event, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and looked at my reflection for a long time. I didn't look like the girl who had left Boston years ago with a degree from a state school and a chip on her shoulder. I looked like someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be, and that I realized was exactly why I had to walk into that club. The next evening, the driver eased the Mercedes to the curb on Beacon Street, and the Boston Heritage Club rose up in front of me like a polished memory stone columns, brass lanterns, windows throwing warm light across the sidewalk, as if the building itself was smiling for a portrait. The October air had a clean edge to it, the kind that makes silk feel colder against your skin. I smoothed my dress deep, navy quiet power, and stepped out my heels, settling on the granite with a soft, decisive tap. A doorman in a peaked cap tipped his head as if we'd known each other for years. Inside, the smell hit first beeswax old books, something citrus in the polish on the banister. Strings from a live quartet drifted from the ballroom, a bright run of notes that fell like glass beads across the marble floor. The foyer was a study in understatement, oil portraits with kind eyes and ruthless histories, rugs softened by generations of careful steps, the whisper of good fabric moving past good fabric. This was my father's habitat, familiar and curated, and it still somehow managed to make a person feel like a guest in a country where the customs had never been written down. I didn't scan the crowd for him. Not yet. I let the room come to me the way markets open slowly at first, then all at once. A waiter passed with champagne. I took a flute and held it without drinking, letting the chill of the glass anchor my hand. People were arriving in waves, bankers with soft voices and sharper pens, professors who'd learned to turn certainty into a career spouses in gowns that whispered when they turned. I recognized more faces than I expected. There was a former dean who used to pat my shoulder and call me creative the way people label a box that won't close. A neighbour from Beacon Hill who once told my mother I had a good personality, her smile pinched around the word. And then, past a column in a circle of careful laughter, my father, his profile carved in light. He looked as if he'd stepped out of a photograph. Tailored tucks, silver hair combed to a mathematical part, champagne held at the angle of a man comfortable with applause. Jack stood just behind his right shoulder, not hovering just close enough that anyone looking would understand they moved as a pair. My brother wore the room like it was cut for him. Jaw, easy tie, perfectly aligned. One hand in his pocket as he listened, laughed, nodded at the exact right beats. I stayed where I was and watched. Not hiding, observing. It was a skill I'd honed in rooms like this in conference halls and boardrooms, and it had never failed me. Listen for the story under the story. A cluster of guests to my left were trading tiny gleaming rumours about a merger. Across from them, a couple argued softly about which charity gala had the better seating chart. The music climbed, then thinned the quartet, taking a turn towards something livelier. I shifted to the edge of the ballroom and let the light catch my shoulder enough to be seen without becoming a spectacle. It worked. A woman with a diamond brooch shaped like a winter star paused, blinked, then offered a cautious smile, the kind people give when they cannot place you, but assume you might be someone. "You're with the Mercers?" she asked. I tilted my head, neither confirming nor denying, and she moved on, satisfied by the possibility. A minute later, a laugh I knew too well cut through the music. Colin. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. Entitlement has a frequency. Still, I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, shorter than I remembered. Or maybe the room had grown, wearing a tux that tried too hard and a grin that didn't. He clocked me stalled, then rearranged his face into the kind of polite interest reserved for LinkedIn connections and exes at weddings. "Sloane," he said, sliding up beside me as if we'd arrived together. "Boston suits you. So does a borrowed spotlight," I said, lightly, taking a sip I didn't need. He laughed, a sound that wanted to be warm, and landed somewhere around tepid. "Heard you left Midtown." "Brave. Startups are volatile." He let the last word hang heavy with meaning, the way you might wave a match near paper. I met his eyes, held them. Volatility is where the returns live, I said. But it takes a steady hand. Not everyone has one. His mouth twitched, still full of surprises. You'd be amazed, I said. For a second, I thought he might press. Might try one of those little digs he'd perfected, questions that sounded like compliments if you didn't know the edges. But he glanced past me instead, toward the small stage being set at the far end of the ballroom, where a lectern was taking shape under a spill of white flowers. His attention drifted the way it always did, to wherever the credit was about to move. I should say, hello to the honoree, he said, slipping away before I could reply. I watched him cross the room, his shoulders squared as if proximity to the powerful could work like osmosis. He reached my father and waited for the conversational tide to shift. When it did, he leaned in, shook hands, laughed at something I couldn't hear, and stood a millimetre taller. Their old rhythm reasserted itself, my father at the centre, the orbit forming around him, and I felt that old tightness in my chest try to return. It didn't. Not tonight. I finished the champagne and set the glass on a passing tray. A new wave of arrivals swept through the doors, and in the wake I saw her Eleanor Price, the media mogul whose face was as familiar as a network's top-of-hour slate. Taller than I expected, severe in a way that read as power rather than cruelty. She moved through the room like a person used to deciding what mattered. I angled a step sideways, not toward her, just into her line of sight. Not yet, I told myself. Let the room ripen. My mother appeared then, a soft brush of grey silk at the edge of the crowd. She wasn't with my father. She was skirting the perimeter the way she always had, offering small smiles, accepting air kisses, adjusting a strap on someone's shoulder, with the reflex of a person who had kept many nights from falling apart. When her eyes found mine, the smile changed. Something warmer. She didn't come over and I didn't beckon. We had learned this language, quiet, present, careful with the moment. The quartet shifted songs. The lights in the chandeliers dimmed a half-step subtle as a breath. In the far corner, a staffer tested a microphone. The club's director climbed the steps to the lectern and checked his watch. People began to drift toward the stage, in that unspoken, practiced way, conversations closing like books set gently aside. I moved with them, threading between groups, catching fragments of talk, a sabbatical in Provence, a nephew's Rhodes scholarship, a grant renewed, because someone knew someone who knew someone. I stopped at the edge of a marble pillar that gave me a clean view of the lectern and of my father's circle just to the right of it. Jack leaned in to say something to him. My father nodded, eyes scanning the room in small economical arcs. For a second, one heartbeat, maybe two, his gaze slid over me and paused. Recognition didn't register, not fully. More like the human brain acknowledging a shape it should catalogue later. Then someone touched his elbow and the moment dissolved. Good, I thought. Let him be surprised on stage. Let him see me when the lights are already pointed his way. I shifted my weight, checking the line of sight again. My plan wasn't complicated. Good plans rarely are. Be seen, be calm, be undeniable. If asked, answer. If tested, don't flinch. And when the right question finds you, let the truth do the talking. A hand brushed my arm. You look stunning, a voice said. Vicky. She'd arrived without my noticing, because that was how she moved, clean, efficient, precise. It's a good room for you. It's his room, I said, eyes still on the stage. Tonight, it's ours, she replied, then melted back into the crowd, as if she'd merely been a thought I'd had. The club director tapped the mic once, twice. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice smooth, if you'll please take your seats. Chairs appeared as if conjured. Tables clicked into their final positions. I took a step out from the pillar and let the nearest circle widen to accommodate me. No apology in the movement. Across the aisle, Colin watched me with narrowed curiosity. Beyond him, my father adjusted his cufflinks. Jack's chin lifted, scanning. Eleanor Price took a seat at the head table and glanced around the room the way a camera lens finds focus. The night had a shape now. I could feel it. I drew in a slow breath, steady and quiet, and let the room reflect back a version of me it had never been invited to see. Someone who wasn't here to be tolerated. Someone who had come to change the temperature. Whatever they thought they knew about me would not survive this evening. One way or another, they would leave with a different picture. The programme moved forward with the kind of polished precision the Heritage Club was famous for. The director gave a short introduction about my father's decades of service to academia, his published works, his influence on policy. There was polite applause after each sentence, the kind of applause that belongs to a room already convinced of its own importance. A retired senator spoke next, telling a story about how my father had once corrected an economic model in a briefing on the back of a napkin and saved the country millions. The crowd laughed in all the right places, as if the anecdote had been rehearsed, which, knowing this world, it probably had. I kept my place near the edge of the room, my champagne glass refilled by a passing waiter, my eyes on the head table. Jack was leaning back in his chair, one ankle resting on the opposite knee, scanning the room with that quiet satisfaction of someone who believes the night belongs to his family. Colin sat a few tables away, already engaged in a side conversation with a hedge fund manager, his attention flickering toward me and away again. Then, in a lull between speeches, I felt it a shift in the air, small but distinct, like the moment before the first drop of rain. Eleanor Price was on her feet. I'd been aware of her since she arrived, her presence pulling at the room like gravity, but now she was walking toward me, unhurried but direct. Her gaze was level, assessing the kind of look that didn't wander once it had settled on you. "You're Sloane Mercer, aren't you?" she said, stopping just close enough that the people around us would hear. I nodded, my voice even. "I am. I thought so." She gave a small, satisfied smile. "I recognise you from the CNN feature on Aurora Capital Partners. You're the founder." It wasn't loud, but the timing was surgical. Her words slid into a brief silence between conversations, and the ripples began immediately. Heads turned first in curiosity, then in recognition. Aurora Capital Partners. The name carried weight now. It had been in headlines on investor panels in those glossy leaders-to-watch lists. I could feel the eyes moving over me differently, measuring, recalculating, connecting dots they hadn't considered before. "Yes," I said simply. "I am." Eleanor's smile deepened, and she tilted her head just slightly as if inviting me to say more. "We've been following your work," she said. "Impressive portfolio, especially for someone who keeps such a low profile." "I've always preferred results over noise," I replied, letting the words rest on the surface of the moment without sinking too far. From my periphery, I caught the subtle stillness of Jack's posture ankle dropping back to the floor, shoulders tightening. Colin's conversation stalled completely. His companion glanced between us, recognizing the name and perhaps the story behind it. And then there was my father. He was seated at the head table, engaged with the person to his left, but I could see the flicker of attention shift my way. Not full recognition yet, but the kind of look you give when a detail doesn't quite fit your mental picture. Eleanor glanced toward the stage where the MC was checking notes. "They'll be calling your father up in a moment," she said. "You'll be staying for the whole programme. I think I'll see how it unfolds," I said. "Sometimes the most interesting moments are unscripted." She laughed softly, the sound warm, but knowing then, excused herself with a hand lightly brushing my arm, moving back toward the head table. Around me, the room had changed temperature. Conversations resumed, but threads of speculation were running underneath. A man in a navy tux asked if we'd met at the Tech Impact Awards. A woman with a pearl comb in her hair said she'd read about our investment in a sustainable energy startup. Each question was another thread tying my name to Aurora, weaving it into the fabric of this carefully curated guest list. Across the room, Jack's eyes found mine. He didn't smile. His gaze was steady, unreadable, but there was a question in it, maybe even a warning. I held it for a beat, then looked away, giving him nothing. The MC returned to the microphone, clearing his throat into the hush. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the moment we've all been waiting for. Please join me in welcoming tonight's honoree, a man whose intellect and integrity have shaped generations, Professor Richard Mercer. Applause swelled chairs scraping as people rose to their feet. My father stood adjusted his tux jacket and walked to the lectern with that same measured stride I remembered from childhood, a pace that demanded the world adjust to him, never the other way around. The lights shifted slightly toward the stage, and as they did, a few faces still turned toward me, curiosity lingering. The fuse Eleanor had lit was burning quietly now, its glow hidden in the folds of polite applause. My father reached the microphone, shook the director's hand and looked out over the room. "Thank you," he began, his voice even and warm. "It's an honor to be among friends, colleagues and former students. You've all shaped my journey in ways you may not realize." He glanced once in my direction, and this time the pause was noticeable. A blink, a fractional narrowing of the eyes. Then he moved on, launching into a story about his first lecture at Harvard. I listened, but my attention was split, part of me tracking the speech, the other part, aware that the moment was coming. The recognition would land, the questions would grow, and when they did, I would be ready. The recognition would land, the questions would grow, and when they did, I would be ready. My father's speech was winding down, his voice steady as ever, each word measured like a professor delivering a lecture he'd given a dozen times before. He closed one anecdote with a perfectly timed pause, drawing out the polite laughter and applause. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, a voice broke through the hum. Professor Mercer Eleanor Price called her tone cordial, but clear, before we wrap. "May I ask something?" The room quieted in that way it does, when everyone senses an interesting turn. My father smiled politely, gesturing for her to continue. "Do you know," she said, "that one of your guests tonight is the founder of Aurora Capital Partners?" His brows lifted slightly, curiosity flickering across his face. "Is that so? I wasn't aware." He scanned the tables, and I felt the weight of the moment tip toward me. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "She's sitting just over there," she said, her hand making the smallest gesture in my direction. Every head turned like a tide changing course. The pause was long enough for me to decide if I wanted this stage now was the time to take it. I stood, letting the scrape of my chair carry in the quiet, and offered a small smile. "That's true," I said, my voice calm but carrying. "Aurora Capital Partners is mine. I started it 5 years ago. We manage just over $1 billion in assets today." The words fell into the space like a stone into still water. The ripple was immediate soft gasps, the sudden uptick in whispers. My father's expression didn't falter, but I saw it the tightening at the corner of his mouth, the way his eyes locked on me, as if recalibrating every assumption. Jack had gone still, beside him, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. I could have stopped there. That alone would have been enough to shift the room, to rewrite whatever quiet footnote my name had been in this crowd's collective memory. But I hadn't come here just to change my headline. I had come for the truth. I took a step forward, closing the distance between my table and the open space before the stage. "You know, Dad," I said, still looking up at him, "there's something else I should mention. The reason I left my first firm wasn't just ambition." My voice held steady even as the air tightened around us. It was sabotage. The room froze. "Colin Whitford," I said, turning just enough to meet his eyes across the crowd, took my analysis, rewrote it, deleted my original, and claimed it as his own. It cost me a promotion. But that wasn't the worst part. I let the beat stretch, the silence press in. Then I turned back toward the stage. "The worst part," I said, locking eyes with Jack now, is that he did it at your suggestion. His face went pale, the colour draining as fast as the composure he'd always worn like armour. That's not, he started, but the room was too quiet for his voice to hide in. You knew exactly what you were doing, I said, not raising my voice, just placing the truth where everyone could see it. You told him I wasn't to be trusted, that sometimes you had to use a little strategy to keep your place. And you watched me take the fall. Colin's head dropped, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth, as if the pattern could swallow him. My father looked from me to Jack, then back again, the disbelief sharp on his face. Is that true? He asked, his voice lower now, more dangerous for its restraint. Jack opened his mouth closed. It tried again. I was protecting what was ours, he said finally, though it sounded weak even to him. A murmur rolled through the crowd, some shifting in their seats, others exchanging quick, tight glances. The golden child myth had cracked right there in the middle of the Heritage Club ballroom. I took another step back away from the stage, not in retreat, but in conclusion. I built something on my own, I said, letting my gaze sweep the room. Without your name, without your approval, without your protection. And I came here tonight not to ask for recognition, but to put the truth in the room where it belongs. My father stood motionless, hands braced on the lectern. Jack stared at me, as if I'd rewritten the rules in a language he didn't speak. Somewhere to my left, I heard the faint pop of a champagne cork, absurdly loud in the stillness. Enjoy the rest of your evening, I said simply, then turned, walking toward the doors as the murmurs swelled behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The picture they'd had of me was gone, replaced by something they'd have to reckon with on their own. The picture they had had of me was gone, replaced by something they'd have to reckon with on their own. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the cool night air of the club's terrace. Behind me, the ballroom's polished laughter and clinking glasses muffled into a low, steady hum, like a party happening in another lifetime. The scent of expensive perfume still clung faintly to my hair, mingling with the salt in the harbour breeze. My heels clicked against the stone until I stopped at the far edge, gripping the cold railing. Only then did I exhale. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation began to ebb, replaced by something heavier, an odd mix of vindication and grief. Winning changes the game, but it doesn't rewind the years you played it alone. I thought of the many times I had stood on the edges of Mercer family gatherings as a teenager, watching Jack hold court, watching my father's proud smile beam down at him. Tonight, I'd finally broken through the glass wall between us, but the shards were still sharp, and I wasn't sure anyone would try to piece them together. The terrace door opened with a faint creak. Sloane. My father's voice was quieter than I'd expected. I turned. He stood in the doorway. Bow tie loosened a slight slump in his shoulders that I'd never seen before. He walked toward me slowly, the click of his shoes deliberate as though measuring each step. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. There was no anger in his tone, just confusion, maybe even hurt. I kept my hands on the railing. Because you decided who I was a long time ago, I said. You called me Never the Bright One when I was 18. You didn't see me then, and I didn't trust you to see me now. His jaw flexed. I was hard on you because I thought it would make you stronger. I met his eyes. No, you were hard on me because you didn't believe in me, and the only thing it made me want was to get as far away from you as possible. He looked away toward the city lights over the harbour. I followed Aurora's work, he admitted after a pause. I even saw that CNN piece. I thought the man running it had vision. I let out a dry laugh. You liked me better when you didn't know it was me. His mouth twitched, but not into a smile. Maybe I did, he said quietly, and for a moment I almost saw something like shame in his expression. Before either of us could say more, the door opened again. My mother stepped into the soft light, her evening shawl wrapped tight against the breeze. She moved toward us, her heels barely making a sound on the stone. "Everything all right out here?" she asked, though her eyes had already taken in the tension. Without a word, she slid her hand over mine on the railing, her touch warm grounding. She was always the bright one, my mother said, her gaze fixed on my father. He didn't respond right away. His eyes flicked from her to me, then down at the ground, as if searching for something he'd misplaced years ago. My mother stayed beside me, her presence solid. "Do you remember freshman year?" she said softly, turning to me. "You called home and said you couldn't afford all your books. I mailed you that envelope, $500, and a note about coffee." I nodded. "I still have the note?" She smiled faintly. I wanted to do more, but her voice trailed off. "You were afraid of rocking his boat," I finished for her. She didn't deny it. I thought keeping the peace was the best I could do, but I see now that all it did was make you fight alone. My father shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped behind his back. "I didn't know she'd done that," he said almost to himself. "There's a lot you didn't know," I replied, not unkindly, but with the weight of the truth between us. Silence settled over the terrace. The sounds of the party inside floated out in faint burst laughter, the swell of jazz, the muffled clink of silverware. We stood there like three islands connected by the same ocean, but each with our own shoreline. My mother's hand tightened on mine. "You were always more than bright enough," she said, her voice certain now. "They just refused to see it." My father finally met my eyes again, and for the first time I didn't feel small under his gaze. We weren't reconciled, we weren't fixed, but we were no longer pretending. I straightened, releasing the railing. "Good night," I said, not to end the conversation forever, but to claim my exit for tonight. I stepped past them toward the door. The warmth of the ballroom hit me as I opened it, and the hum of voices swelled again, but I didn't glance back. Whatever they chose to do with the truth now was up to them. I'd carried it long enough. Whatever they chose to do with the truth now was up to them. I'd carried it long enough. 3 weeks later, I was back in my office at Aurora Capital Partners. The morning sun cut across my desk, pooling over a stack of investment reports. My inbox was its usual chaos of pitches, client updates, and travel confirmations. I was halfway through a quarterly performance review when a new subject line caught my eye. From Richard Mercer. Subject lunch, I clicked. "Let's have lunch. I'd like to hear more about the firm." No apology, no explanation, just 12 words. For a moment, I stared at the screen, waiting for the sting I thought would come. It didn't. Instead, there was something else, something quieter. A recognition that this wasn't him waving a white flag, but maybe a door cracked open. I leaned back in my chair, letting my gaze wander over the view from my floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline stretched toward the horizon, glass and steel catching the light. I thought about the night at the Heritage Club, the way the air had felt thick with history and judgment, the way my mother's hand had found mine, the look on my father's face when I told him the truth. That night, I had left them with the weight of it. This email didn't lift it, but it was a shift, however small. I thought about deleting it, about letting the silence stand. But silence had served me long enough. Sure, I typed back, but I choose the place. I hit send. That evening, I stood by the window of my Manhattan apartment, a glass of wine in hand. The city was alive below me. Yellow cabs streaming through intersections, the hum of late-night traffic drifting up from the avenues, the lights of offices still burning in glass towers. Somewhere out there, my father was waiting for my reply, and for the first time I wasn't thinking about how to earn his approval. I wasn't thinking about what he thought at all. My reflection looked back at me in the glass, older, sharper, steadier. I had been the girl in the corner of family photos, the one with the smallest frame, the faintest smile. I had been the underestimated hire the name left off the credit slide. I had been the one they never called the bright one. Not anymore. The city lights shimmered, endless and indifferent. My life wasn't going to be defined by a family portrait or a man's opinion or even a $1 billion valuation. It was going to be defined by me. I took one last sip of wine, set the glass down, and let the quiet fill the room. I define who I am. And if you're listening to this, thinking about the words someone once pinned to you, not smart enough, not strong enough, not good enough, I want you to know they don't have to stick forever. You are not the opinion of your parents, your boss, or the people who didn't see you. You're allowed to outgrow the version of you they decided on. Right now, so many people are quietly learning how to heal by setting boundaries, by finding work that excites them, by choosing friends who celebrate them instead of tolerate them. Healing doesn't always look like big declarations or dramatic moments. Sometimes it's as small as saying no to what hurts you or saying yes to what feels true. It's walking away from a table where you've been served nothing but doubt. If you're still in that place where you feel unseen, I want you to believe this. You are building something even if no one claps yet. And when your moment comes, because it will, you won't need their applause to know you've made it. You'll feel it in your bones. If this story has made you see a part of yourself, stick around. There are more stories, like this stories about resilience, about taking back your narrative, about finding the quiet power in being underestimated. Subscribe so the next time you need a reminder of who you are, you'll have it waiting, because you get to define who you are, always.